Welcome back. All right, so now we're going to talk about the first year of the National Hockey League, 1917. The NHL comes into existence November 26th of 1917 to be exact. Basically, some owners meet at a hotel and go, yeah, so Livingstone's got to go, and we're going to change the name of the league to get rid of him, is basically what they're going to do, because really legally they had no reason to get rid of him, and from a legal perspective, and so they would change the name of the league to the NHL. The lawsuits would start from Eddie Livingstone, and we were off. Now, what you'll notice first off is there was a first half and second half of the season, and the team that finished in the first place in the first half plays the team that was first in the second half to decide who the best team in the National Hockey League is. I cannot imagine if they did this now, but at any rate, Montreal won the first half. They were 10-6. Toronto 8-6. Ottawa 5-9. The Montreal Wanderers 1-5 at the time that their building burnt down. So they won one game, and then they were gone. So the second half of the season, there was only 8 games by each team. Montreal was 3-5. Toronto 5-3, and Ottawa 4-4. So by virtue of being 5-3 in that second half of the season, Toronto would play in the NHL playoffs, the final in the NHL, and all that fun stuff. Now, the Quebec Bulldogs opted out because of the number of players that they had that were in the armed forces, so they were over fighting in the war. But of course, that was coming to an end soon. The Quebec Bulldogs would join the National Hockey League after being inactive for a couple of years. January 12th of 1918. I'm going to try not to say 20 and then the date, but 1918. Dave Ritchie became the first player to score for 2 teams in the same season. He had been one of the members of the Montreal Wanderers, who of course all became free agents when their team was gone. And he joined the Ottawa Senators and scored goals with both teams. So interesting little nugget of trivia for all you fine people on the internet. February 18th of 1918, George Vezina gets the first shutout in NHL history over Toronto. So there you go. The first shutout is from Vezina. Yes, the trophy's named after George Vezina. And Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa employed a total of, by my count, 39 players. Yeah, during the season, 39 players, so an average of 13 per team. I think it was Toronto that had 12, but at any rate, yeah, it's interesting to look at how many players play on a roster. Now you can have up to like 40 players, and back then, 12. And so there wasn't really line changes. These guys would play almost the entire game. So, yeah, that had to be pretty tiring. Frank Calder was named the first NHL president, and yes, that's who the Calder Trophy is named after. So Calder became the first NHL president, and he had himself something to look over here because this league was not as financially stable as it would be later, right? On January 9th of 1918, they realized how silly it was that goaltenders weren't allowed to leave their feet, so they allowed goaltenders to leave their feet to make a save because it doesn't make any sense to make them have to stand up to make a save. Which I guess means players weren't allowed to dive to shot block either. So, at any rate, yeah, that rule change went through pretty quickly. And as I mentioned in the PCHA video, the PCHA had already made that change years before, and I'm sure it made the game look a lot better. Keep in mind, goalies, still no masks. You're allowed to dive to play that puck and block it. Yeah, you block it with your face. You're not going to get a mask. But that's a whole other topic for a whole other time when it comes to the masks. Now, Joe Malone, the first NHL star here, 20 games, 44 goals, 4 assists, 48 points. That's ridiculous. He had 5 goals in the first game of the season, ends up with 44 in 20 games. Cy Denny, and these guys are both in the Hall of Fame. In fact, a lot of the names on this board are in the Hall of Fame. Playing for Ottawa, Denny, 21 games, 36 goals, 10 assists, 46 points. Reg Noble of Toronto, 20 games, 29 goals, 10 assists, 39 points. Newsy Lalonde for Montreal, 14 games, 23 goals, 7 assists, 30 points. So playing a lot less games, but still recording a good share of the goals for Montreal. Corb Denny, and that is the brother of Cy, for Toronto, 21 games, 20 goals, 10 assists, 30 points. Harry Cameron of Toronto as well, 21 games, 17 goals, 10 assists, 27 points. Didier Pitre, playing 20 games, 17 goals, 8 assists, 25 points. Eddie Girard of Ottawa, 20 games, 13 goals, 8 assists, 21 points. So assists were nowhere near what they are now. I think they just counted 1 assist back then. I don't think they counted secondaries. Georges Vezina was the best goaltender. He finishes 12-9 with a goals against average of 3.93. So again, scoring's pretty high early on for the National Hockey League. Hap Holmes for Toronto goes 9-7 with a 4.73 goals against average, and Clint Benedict of the Ottawa Senators 9-13 with a 5.11 goals against average. Now, what's interesting to Toronto is I've got the Maple Leafs logo here, but they became known, and we all refer to it now as the Toronto Arena's Stanley Cup. However, they didn't have a nickname officially. They had taken the team away from Eddie Livingstone and the players. Can't call them the Blue Shirts because that's what Eddie Livingstone's team was. So they wore blue. They essentially wore what they wore when they were the Blue Shirts, just didn't call them that. And eventually it would become the Maple Leafs. But first, it became the Toronto Arenas eventually. But yeah, it wasn't that first year. We call it that. In the playoffs, they won a 2-game total goal series. Just imagine if this is how the playoffs were decided now. 2 games and whoever gets the most goals. I know it still happens in soccer in some areas, but still, I don't think hockey fans would be happy. You win because you ran up the score? Yep. Toronto won the first game 7-3, which really backed Montreal into a corner. They won the second game 4-3, but they lose on total goals by a score of 10-7. So Montreal just falls short there. Then in the Stanley Cup final, it was Vancouver and Toronto, and the Vancouver Millionaires extended it to the full 5 games. Cyclone Taylor had 9 goals for Vancouver. Alf Skinner had 8 goals for Toronto, and Mickey McKay had 5 goals for Toronto in that Stanley Cup final. Toronto wins the first game by a score of 5-3. Vancouver wins the second game by a score of 6-4. Toronto won 6-3 over Vancouver in the third game. Vancouver destroys Toronto 8-1 in the fourth game, and then Toronto locks things down in that final game to win 2-1. So Toronto wins the first Stanley Cup. They're technically an expansion team when they do win said Stanley Cup. And I mean, as a Vancouver fan, wouldn't that be great if the Millionaires had won that cup in 1918? But they just fall short. And it is interesting that it's Vancouver and Toronto that are playing in that Stanley Cup final, because if that happened in the National Hockey League now, well, that would be a very, very interesting final indeed. So these are your 3 survivors. The NHL is going to add some teams over the coming years. Of course, Ottawa would drop. They would move to St. Louis, and then they would fold from St. Louis. Somehow Toronto and Montreal, they survived this turbulent time where the league's not making a ton of money. Attendance was not that high either. So ticket sales, and of course they're riding trains from one location to another. So yeah, you have to keep it to that localized area and then eventually expand, which the NHL would. But there you go, the first season of the National Hockey League's history. The messy part would be the Wanderers building burning down and all those players becoming free agents. And of course they're still fighting with the PCHA at this time, but they get that first season done. And they get their first Stanley Cup for the league. Eventually, the Stanley Cup would just be contested by NHL teams. But we're not there yet. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've not done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support, as always. I will talk to you again soon.